for loops are fixed iterative loops in which the loop executes a certain number of times, and the execution is based on some variable which is a counter, and it can use either a number or an integer as far as the data type. But here's our structure, the keyword for, and inside parentheses we have three statements separated by semicolons. The first is a statement that initializes the counter. The second is a Boolean test. And then the third is a statement that changes the value of the counter so that we don't end up with an endless loop. Inside the curly brackets then of the for loop that follows that is the statement or group of statements that are to be executed if the Boolean test is holding true. And as long as that Boolean test is true, these statements will be repeated. So this is the generic. Here's an actual example. I've got a variable called xyz. I've set it to a number data type. My for statement, I'm going to initialize xyz as equaling 20. And then as long as xyz is greater than or equal to 0, it's going to do this code. And I'm incrementing xyz. Now, I actually made a mistake here because xyz would go to 21 and then 22 and 23, and it's always going to be greater than or equal to 0, which also puts us into an endless loop. So I want to decrement xyz because I'm actually going to have it count down from 20 to 0. So I'm going to change this to minus minus, or I could have said minus equals 1. And what's going to happen in this loop is it's going to add to a text box named display_txt. It's going to append to that the value of xyz and a carriage return. And so if you can think of a text box with multiple lines, I would get 20 on the first line, 19 on the second, 18 on the next, 17 on the next, and so forth, all the way down to 0. We'll do that example in a minute. Let me first show you another kind of classic example in terms of repetition, and that is somebody who has had to stay after school to write something on the board a multiple number of times. So I have down here a text box, an input box, in which the phrase we want to have repeated is written. So the phrase was, "I will not chew gum in class." And I'm going to click on the Stay After School button, and that will write that statement 10 times on the chalkboard. Let me just test this. And there's a statement. Maybe I want to change the code here to, "I will pay better attention to the instructor's videos. Stay after school." And now that's what's written on the board. So let's look at the code of how this works. So I have my button with the event listener calling a function called repeat on board. Here's my function. I'm going to clear out the text of the text box, which is named blackboard.txt, or the text box named blackboard, clearing out the text. I've got a variable I, which is a number. Here's my for loop. I is going to start out equaling to 0, and as long as I is less than or equal to 10, it's going to execute this code of appending whatever is in the phrase_txt text box. That's the one at the bottom, in which we're writing the phrases to be repeated. And I'm going to concatenate to that a new line character. So that's the \n inside of quotes. That will give us a new line each time through. And we get the 10 repetitions then of that code. Now if I just simply change this to, say, a 5, I'm starting with 1. So I'm actually going to write it 6 times. Actually, let's just change this to a 1 instead of a 0. Now we'll write it 5 times. So my loop is going to go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And let's execute this. And it's written 5 times on the board. So previously I gave the example of having a text box in which we want numbers to be recorded in the text box, 1 on each line. We're going to go from 20 to 0. And I'm going to set my text box to be a dynamic text box. We'll show the border. And I want this to be multi-line. And I'm going to stretch this text box all the way down here to the side. And so we can see this a little bit better. I'm going to center the text. And just to get an idea of the size of the text, so that might be a little bit big in terms of trying to get 20 numbers in there. I'm going to set this down to 13. And let's create a button. So here I want this to be static text. My button's just simply going to say test. And I'll make that a little bit larger. I'm going to right click, turn that into a button. And I'll name this test_btn. Let's add an actions layer, create an action. Respond to a mouse event of type click. And I'm going to call this countdown for my function. We'll write the function. Not return anything, so type void. And let's create a variable. I used XYZ in the example, so I'll use that here. And we'll make that a number. My for loop will initialize XYZ to 20. As long as XYZ is greater than or equal to 0, we want our loop to continue. And I'm going to take XYZ and decrement it using the minus. And I want my two curly brackets for the loop. And now inside the loop, what I want to have happen is my code in that text box, or display in the text box, which I don't think we named. Let me go back here, select this. We need to give this an instance name. So we'll call it display _txt. Go back to our code. Actually, it's append. We use the append text method. And we'll cover strings in the next lesson. So some of this goes a little beyond what you've already known, but this append.text will simply keep adding text to our text in the text box. And what we want to append here is xyz.toString. And I'm going to concatenate \n, which is a new line character. And let's test. Make sure we have no errors. Oh, I need to embed my fonts. So let me take our text box here and embed the fonts. Really only need numbers, but I'm going to go ahead and do all of them. Just sort of my standard practice. Doesn't add that much to our application. And now let's test. So I click the test button, and there's our numbers of 20 through 0. Now here's another example of using a for loop. Again, I'm going to use some strings or characters to display the output for this. And I've actually got two buttons, one that will show the alphabet from A to Z, one that will take the decimal value of a letter. My default here is 65, which is a capital A, and display the next 4 letters after that. And we'll talk about how we get to 65 next week, but it's basically a decimal value of the binary representation for a capital A. Capital B would be 66, a capital C is 67, and so forth. A lowercase a would be 97. So let me just show you the code. I don't expect you to understand all the code at this point. However, it will give you an example or show you another way in which for loops might be used. So I have this show alphabet button. It's going to call this method. And here I'm using a loop starting at 65 and going to 90. 65 is a capital A and 90 is the capital Z. And then what I'm going to do in this alphabet text is simply concatenate to that text the character from that number. So it's going to convert the 65 to an A, the 66 to a B, and so forth. So this is an example of using a range here from 65 to 90 that actually has some meaning beyond the numbers. When I'm showing the next 5, I'm going to take whatever the first value is. So if I have 65, it's going to be an A. And then in a for loop, I'm simply going to show the next character, and I'm going to show the code that can be used in ActionScript to display that character, which is called from char code. And we'll cover strings more next week, and this will make a little more sense after that. So right now, I just want you to get the feel for how for loops might be used. Let me test this movie. So I'm going to click Show Alphabet, and there's our alphabet. And if I say Show Next 5, we'll get a capital A, B, C, D, E. Now if I do a, say a 98, that's going to be a lowercase b, and we get lowercase b, c, d, e, f. Come back and do a 68, that's going to be an uppercase D. And I can even do other characters. So I do 32. Notice I'm getting a space and then an exclamation, quote, pound sign or hashtag, and the $sign. So I can actually write a program here that would show me all the different characters for a font. And if you're familiar with the CharMap utility built into Windows, that's exactly what they're doing. They're basically displaying all the characters for all the different ASCII codes or Unicode. Here's another example in which the user can enter a phrase into a text area. This is a component that we'll look at much later in the semester. And I'm going to look at each character individually using a for loop, and the length or the expression that's being evaluated for the Boolean is going to be based on how many characters there are in the text that I enter. So that Boolean expression is dynamic in and of itself based on the length of the phrase that's entered. It's going to keep track of how many consonants, vowels, punctuation characters, spaces, numerals, and the total number of characters. So let me just try this and I'll show you the code. So my phrase was my dog ate my homework, comma, again, exclamation. Click submit. And I'm told there are 14 consonants, 9 vowels, 2 punctuation characters, the comma and the exclamation. There are 5 spaces, no numerals, and there's 30 characters total. If I were to change this and say, welcome to CIS 220 DC, click submit. Now there are 9 consonants, 5 vowels, no punctuation characters, 2 spaces, and I have 3 numerals there, the 220, and there's 19 characters total. So let's take a look at our code. So I have a submit button, and that submit button is running this function called submit when it's clicked. I've got some variables to keep track of the different types of characters that I'm looking for. And then here's my for loop. My for loop is starting with 0, which is going to be the first character. And we'll see in the next lesson that the first character is always 0. We start counting with 0. And then it's going to look at every character up to the length of my phrase. My phrase is that text area that we're entering the text into. And I'm going to increment it each time through the loop. So I'm looking at the next character, and the next character, next character. I'm going to evaluate that character and find out the char code. That's the decimal value of the character. So if my first letter is a capital A, that's going to be 65. And then I've got an if, else if structure here. So if my char equals 32, that's a space. If it's between 48 and 57, that's a numeral. if my char equals 65, 69, 73, 79, or 85, that's A-E-I-O-U, it's a vowel. Otherwise, if it's between 65 and 90, I'm going to mark that as a consonant. And if it's none of those, I'm going to consider it punctuation. Then I'm simply outputting those values through concatenation to my output text box. Here's another example of using a for loop. I've got a button called roll 'em, and I'm going to simulate rolling a pair of dice or a pair of die 1,000 times. And I want to create a little bar chart here that's going to show me how many times each roll came up from 2 to 12. Here's our code. So I've got an event listener for the click event on our roll button. It's going to call a function called roll 'em. I've got a variable called I, which is an integer. And then I've got a for loop that is going to set each of these roll underscore or roll I underscore txt. So this is going to be roll 1 underscore txt, roll 2 underscore txt, roll 3 underscore txt, and that is how I have named these different text boxes. So roll 2, roll 3, roll 4. Of course, we didn't start with roll 1 because you can't roll a 1 with a pair of die. Let's go back and look at our code here. And so I can use this root keyword, and in square brackets I can create the name of the control or object that I want to look at through concatenation. So roll plus I is going to be a value starting at 2 plus underscore txt, and then outside of these square brackets the property that I'm going to set dot text equals 0. That would set all 12 of those or all 11 of those text boxes to 0. Then I'm doing the same thing with the bars. Each of these rectangles are movie clips that are named bar 2 underscore MC, bar 3 underscore MC, and so forth down to bar 12. And I'm setting the width of those to 2 pixels. Then I'm going to roll my die. So I've got variables for those along with the total. I'm going to use the math.random method and get the math.floor math.random times 6 plus 1. That'll give me a number between 1 and 6 and give me an integer value. I'm going to add die 1 and die 2 to get the total. I'm going to get the text that's in that text box, converting it to a number, XYZ being a number. I'm going to increment XYZ by 1. That's the number that was rolled. So if I rolled a 7, I'm going to get whatever value is in 7, add 1 to it. Then I'm going to display that back out, and I'm going to increment the bar by 2. So we're going to roll our die 1,000 times, and watch how quickly this happens. Basically, as fast as we can blink our eyes, we're rolling that die 1,000 times. That's how fast this for loop is executing. And computers, of course, today can do billions of instructions per second. You notice I can keep rolling these, and just by random generation, I'm going to get different numbers each time. But you can see the bell curve there that 7 statistically should come up the most. Once in a great while, you might get 6 or 8 to beat it, but usually 7 is going to be the most. So there I've got 8, just slightly more than 7. And that's pretty rare. 2 and 12 are going to come up the least. Now here's another kind of fun use of a for loop. I've got 4 different movie clips over here in terms of graphic design, and some radio buttons where I could choose one or the other. And then I'm going to draw a spiral graph using whatever design I've chosen, and I've got a button here to erase that. Let me just demonstrate this first. So I'm going to start with the circle, draw my spiral graph. That's pretty cool. I'm going to erase that. Let's choose this little kind of propeller design. Draw that as a spiral graph. That's pretty cool. Let's erase that. I'm going to take the word SMCC with a line, make a spiral graph out of that. And then finally, I'm we've got another little design here. Draw a spiral graph. And I can actually, if I wanted to, add to whatever's drawn there. And combine these. So let's look at the code for this. Again, not overly complicated. I've got my duplicate button, my erase button, and then I've got those 4 radio buttons that I'm keeping track of which one of those is selected. And then I'm using something here called an array, and we'll look at arrays in about 3 or 4 weeks. Arrays are simply variables that let me contain more than one value. Again, I don't expect you to understand all that's happening here, but what I want you to see is when I click that duplicate button, which is going to draw the spiral graph, there is a for loop here that's going to draw that object 36 times. And each time through that loop, I'm going to rotate each object slightly. And I'm using an add child statement to actually draw the object on the stage. My erase, here's my set element, which is simply determining which radio button was selected so I know which object to draw with. And then my erase function is simply selecting all of those objects that were drawn and getting rid of them. And I've got a variable here to keep track of how many elements there are. That's my active element. So you can see, fairly cool program, but not that much code, only 50 lines of code. That's the power of a for loop. And then the last example here is one we looked at previously in terms of summing numbers, but I'm going to use some text boxes getting input from the user to determine what the sums are between the numbers. So this is actually a button. So what is the sum of the numbers between 1 and 10? 55. Now if I paid a person a penny on the first day and doubled it each day, and they worked for me for 5 days, how much would I pay them? I'd pay them 31 cents. If they worked for me for 10 days, how much would I pay them? $10.23. So the first day is a penny, the second day is 2 cents, the next day is 4 cents, fourth day is 8 cents, and so forth. So it's just doubling the payment period each day. But what if they were to work for me for 30 days? How much would they get? How much would they make based on this pay schedule? And you can see they'd make over $10 million. Next time you're looking to negotiate a pay raise, you might ask for this in writing and see if the person will fall for it. Let's look at our code. So on the first one, we're summing the 2 numbers. I'm getting the value from low underscore txt and the value from high underscore txt, converting those to numerical values, and I'm simply using them here in the for loop in terms of initiating my variable I to whatever low is, and as long as it's less than high, I'm going to keep doing this loop and we'll increment it by 1 each time. And then I'm simply adding that value to sum and displaying the result in my text box called answer underscore txt. On question number 2, I'm starting with a penny for my pay rate. I have a variable to keep track of total pay, the number of days that are being worked. So if I entered 5, 10, or 30, or something else, that would be used in my loop. My day is going to start at 1, and the number of days is going to utilize those work days. And I'm going to increment each day by 1. My total pay is going to equal the pay rate, but then every time through the loop, I'm going to double the pay rate and then finally display the answer.